nearly a week ago, you gave an interview to the Financial Times titled, "Can a Wider Middle East War Be Averted?" And the recent developments point to serious escalations in several places, of which the most notable are probably the direct strikes by Iran in Iraq and Syria. It's the first time the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps actually adopt an attack directly. How do you read these developments? Will contained attacks and retaliation, so a low boiling war sort of, become the norm for a while? Or is there no escape from an all-out regional war?
Well, first of all, thanks, Diana, so much for having me on with Kulluna Irada. Thank you to Karim Bitar as well, and all of you who invited me to speak to you in this session. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces to talk about what is, really a very important, sensitive, and complex and evolving situation in the region since October the 7th. One which I find has been also very difficult sometimes for people to analyze and to observe, because it's a fast-moving situation, and also because it's a sensitive topic wherever you're sitting. And I found that it's very important also to be able to, as analysts, be able to explain the situation, the facts, the events, without this sounding like we are justifying anything. So I think it's important as analysts and as policymakers, which many of you are, to be able to understand the rationale of the different players and to be able to explain that to your audience, to whoever you're trying to deal with, without it sounding like you're justifying. And I think that is something that has been a little bit lost over the last few months. التفسير هو ليس تبرير, as we say in Arabic, perhaps. But in English, explanation is not justification. And so whether you're trying to understand what the Iranians are planning or doing, or whether you're trying to understand the rationale of Hezbollah or of the Americans or even of the Israelis, because they are a party to this, I think it's important to have the analytical awareness to step back and really analyze the situation. And so when you ask me about the Iranians and what they might be thinking with the direct missile strikes that they conducted against targets which they say was a Mossad base in Erbil, and targets against Syria, but also since then targets in Pakistan, which is really quite extraordinary, because you're now dealing with a nuclear state like Pakistan, which struck back against Iran. So I want to unpack your question a little bit, because there were two aspects of it. What is Iran doing? What is this about? And is a regional conflagration inevitable? I think the Iranians are acting from a point of insecurity. And that often can lead to strategic mistakes. And I think they have made a strategic mistake in targeting Pakistan. And I'll get to that in a second. They have been watching, as Iran, the situation unfold, the war unfold in Gaza, the border clashes in Lebanon over the last 100 days, let's say. And they have not wanted to get dragged into a direct confrontation, either with Israel or with the United States. And we can unpack that a little bit more later on in the conversation when we discuss Lebanon. The Iranians don't want to be in the middle of the war. They are very good at using their proxies, whether it's the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hashd al-Sha'bi, etc., who come, as we all know, you all know the region very well, so I'm speaking to a knowledgeable audience, who come with their different layers of connection to Iran and the IRGC. Hezbollah are not the Houthis, and the Houthis are not the Hashd al-Sha'bi. They all have different roles. And so Iran has been using these different proxies to stave off a direct confrontation between itself and Israel or the United States, because for a moment in the weeks following October 7th, it looked like a direct confrontation might be possible. We got very close to a direct, extensive strike by the Israelis against Lebanon in the days following October 7th, and it was the Americans who dissuaded the Israelis from going ahead with that. So there was a real moment of jeopardy for the Iranians in the first few months where they tried as much as possible to step back. But it reached a stage where they also have to maintain their own credibility as players in the region. It's not enough to say that they support Hamas and they support the Palestinian cause, because a lot of their supporters, whether in the axis of so-called resistance, the axis of resistance as it's known, or whether it's critics, or whether the people on the margins who are not necessarily part of the axis but support the general sentiment, there was a sense of, where is Iran? Where is Hezbollah? Where is Iran? What are they doing? On October the 8th, where was Tehran? Those questions are being asked in the region, and we can unpack that further as well. So Iran is very good at turning moments of jeopardy into moments of opportunity. And for them, the opportunity today is to use this moment of chaos to negotiate with the US, actually, through its proxies, to send signals with the missiles that the Houthis are launching, which is interrupting international shipping lanes, with the border clashes in southern Lebanon, with the strikes against US forces in Iraq and Syria. That becomes a moment of opportunity for the Iranians after a moment of real fear in the weeks after October 7th, to reposition itself and push back against the notion that it's not doing enough. That's the first point. Second, negotiate by fire with the Americans about Iran's position in the region, and send a signal domestically inside Iran that the regime is not impotent, because there was also a terrorist attack inside Iran that killed almost 100 people in Kerman on the anniversary of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. Iran blamed it on Israel, even though ISIS claimed responsibility, but the Iranians said, well, it's Israel manipulating ISIS. And so domestically, they had to show that their raison d'etre, which they constantly advertise to their people, I don't think their people believe it anymore, which is the security of the country. We can't give you economic prosperity, we can't give you very much, but we give you security. Even that they couldn't provide anymore. And so they had to do something. But my reading of how they carried out their response is that it is a strategic mistake. One, because they're getting a lot of criticism for the strike against Erbil and Syria. The Iraqis recalled their ambassador from Tehran. Syria is really kabsh mahra, yani everybody's striking Syria, the Israelis, the Americans, the Iranians. I mean, poor Syria. And I want to talk about Syria as well in the conversation. So the Iraqis are up in arms because there's a tendency to have a focus on America's military actions in the regions, but the Iranians are quite busy as well. And this was one step too far to launch a missile strike at Erbil. And when it comes to Pakistan, striking so-called rebels in Baluchistan, which Iran says were partly responsible for the strike or the bomb attack in Kerman, the Pakistanis have also recalled their chargé d'affaires from Tehran, and they have struck back at Iran. So now Iran is in a bit of a difficult position. What are they going to do? Strike Pakistan again? I don't think they can afford to. This is a nuclear state. I'm not saying we're going to have nuclear war, but you don't joke around with the Pakistanis. So Iran's deterrence has just shown its limits, which is why I think we are not looking at an effort by Iran to detonate the region. They were hoping they could do a couple of strikes, show that they're not, just sitting back and doing nothing, show some deterrence, but I think that has very much a limited effect. And they are probably hoping that this is the extent of it. What it does show is how volatile the whole region is. Going to the second part of your question, is a regional conflagration inevitable? No, I don't think it's inevitable, but every one of those strikes can lead to a misstep. If the Iranians suddenly think that actually they are coming under sustained attack, they might overreact. If the Pakistanis had thought that there was something bigger afoot with those missiles, they could have also overreacted. So everybody has their hand on the trigger, and it's just about making sure that nobody really slips. But we are in a generally very volatile moment in the region. And I know we're going to talk about Lebanon as well. I want to make one very important point, which is that a lot of us are waiting for or asking the question, is a wider war inevitable? We are in a wider war. We already are, right? Whether it's, the Houthis, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Lebanon, Gaza, Israel, we are already in a moment of a low-boil, generalized state of heightened alert and low-intensity conflict.
Great. Thank you, Kim. Maybe we'll talk a bit more on Iran and then move to Lebanon. I mean, other than the strikes on Iran, Iraq, and on Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan, the Iranians, have been until now showing restraint. Some level of restraint. The US has also clearly been showing a lot of restraint. I'm sorry, I haven't. Okay. Iran has mostly, as you have mentioned, managed to work through its proxies. But what are the red lines that would push either side for a direct confrontation? You mentioned what Iran is looking for in this conflict. Will it feel that if it's unable to achieve this, then it will probably need to escalate more? Or do you feel that it's mostly in the hands of the Israelis and the US this time?
So the Iranians have been through various stages since October 7th. They went through, first of all, a very intense period, I think, of panic. Because although they have long supported Hamas and resistance groups, as they call them, whether Hezbollah or others, Hamas sits in a different category because they've had also difficult relations over the last decade in the aftermath of the civil war in Syria and Iran and Hezbollah's support for Bashar al-Assad. Hamas stepped out of and left Syria because they did not want to support that. They did not want to be a party of that, a party to that. And it's only recently that that relationship has been put back together. So the relationship between Hamas and Iran is not the same as between Iran and Hezbollah. And I think, the audience is knowledgeable enough about that. But it's important to remember that, because that explains why, although there was a lot of talk about Tawheed al-Jabahat, the unification of fronts, I don't think the Iranians expected quite what happened on October 7th, right? So there was a general backing for Hamas to conduct an operation in a little bit in the same way as very often there is a clear entente between Hezbollah and Iran. It's not like they push a button and they say, now do this. No, there is a general understanding of what their agenda is. And so Hezbollah has a lot of room to maneuver. And Hamas has as well. And Hamas can be quite recalcitrant about being associated too closely with Iran because they want the mantle of resistance against Israel. And I remember very clearly after 2000, when the Israelis left southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah got credit for that. I asked somebody from Hamas, what did you learn? What do you think you can learn from Hezbollah's experience? And the answer was radical. We were the resistance against Israel first. We don't need to take lessons from anyone. And so I think that tension has never gone away. And so for Iran, the immediate days after October 7th, I think, were one of intense panic and surprise and fear of what Israel might do and what the Americans might do. Because remember, the Americans sent their warships quite quickly to the region. I think that the mot d'ordre, the word, the orders, let's say, between Iran and Hezbollah was to be ready for a possible strike, but lay low to the extent possible. Hezbollah started launching missiles at Israel on October 8th, but it was very limited still. And I know from my conversations with Western diplomats and Arab officials that Iran started signaling very quickly that they were not involved in this and that they did not want to escalate. And they went as far as signaling to Arab countries they wanted a way out, right? So that goes back to what I was just saying about a moment of jeopardy, where they really thought, this is the big moment where we could go to war. And despite all of Iran's rhetoric and bravado, they really don't want a war, a regional war. They would like to avoid that at all cost. And that's a lesson they learned during the Iran-Iraq war. They will fight wars outside of their territory, but they would like to avoid a direct confrontation. And they're actually willing to make, I think, big compromises to avoid a direct confrontation. So as I mentioned, in the immediate 10 days after October 7th, there was a potential for an Israeli strike against Lebanon. I think the one achievement of the Biden administration, because there are a lot of mistakes to say the least, is to have been able to convince Israel that they don't need to strike Lebanon, because should there be further larger attacks against Israel from Hezbollah or Iran, because remember at the beginning we didn't know whether this was just Hamas or Iran and Hezbollah, and the final showdown against Israel that they had planned, nobody was really sure. And there was movement at the border, so the Americans were very concerned. So that Israeli strike was avoided. And
if we
a question that a lot of people are asking themselves in the region, just to wrap up that thought, is why did Iran not go full-fledged in support of Hamas? And my analysis is twofold, because that question is being asked of Hezbollah as well. And Hassan Nasrallah stayed silent for a long time, 4 weeks. And when he came out with his speech, his first speech, he said that Hezbollah is actually doing a lot. You can't see everything. And I think there are two reasons here. One, Iran's rhetoric about support for the Palestinian cause has met its limits. They actually cannot do much more. I'm not sure they want to, but even if they wanted to, they cannot do much more without being attacked.
Jeopardizing their national security, yeah.
Their own territorial integrity and national security. And that is a disappointment to some people. That is a relief to a lot of other people. And most importantly, on the issue of Hezbollah, Hezbollah's role has changed considerably since 2000 and since 2006. And I've said this often in my pieces and on television. Iran doesn't want to deploy Hezbollah in a full-on way, because it knows the retaliation that will come against Lebanon, and it would lose a key asset. I had a very frank discussion once with an Iranian academic who's close to Iranian regime circles, and he said, look, for the Iranian regime, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria are forward defense bases. And that means that Hezbollah is a first line of defense. So they need to preserve that for the moment when and if Iran comes under threat directly. That's the red line. If they feel that Israel is going to strike them directly, not Qasem Soleimani in Iraq or not Saleh al-Aruri in Beirut, but directly, then it's a game changer. And that's where the US is also towing a very difficult or tight line, whereby they're trying to deter Iran from taking this further without making Iran think, oh my God, they're about to target Iran itself.
Okay, clear. Thank you, Kim. If we want to move to Lebanon, what's your take on the indirect negotiations that are taking place between Hezbollah and Israel through the U.S. envoy Amos Hochstein? I mean, will the U.S. be able to continue to avert a war on Israel's northern front? I mean, one theory, of course, is that no diplomatic agreement will be enough for Israel at this stage. This is an existential war for the state of Israel. The safe return of their northern inhabitants is a key consideration. And given the current context, they will try to escalate and attempt an all-out attack on Hezbollah. Gallant has stated today that the possibility of a war is increasing even further. And of course, the counter argument to that is that the war on Gaza is already too costly in its own right. The Israelis have not so far been able to claim a big win other than Saleh al-Aruri. And the US has a lot of questions on whether Israel is able to claim a win in Lebanon over Hezbollah, and therefore, I mean, trying to convince them as much as possible that a war on Hezbollah would be a bad move at the moment. What do you think are the possible scenarios for Lebanon? And most importantly, do you think the US will support Israel, whatever their decision may be? I mean, if the Israelis decide to go on an all-out war in Lebanon, will the US support, despite the fact that it's clear that the US does not want this?
If I may take away your moderator prerogative just for a second, because we got a question about the last answer. So I'll just answer it very quickly. From Rima Al-Husseini saying, what do I mean really by a first position of panic by the Iranians? The panic was about the fact that they thought the Israelis and the Americans were going to strike Iran immediately in retaliation for the Gaza attack, because at first people thought that Iran was directly behind Hamas's decision to strike Israel in this fashion. And then the intelligence showed that Iran was not aware. So the immediate reaction by Iran was fear that they were going to be attacked in retaliation. Now, when it comes to Lebanon, we're all following, very closely, and I don't think I can add more to what you're all reading, in the papers and following, I think, on a day-to-day basis. And, I wrote a piece in the Financial Times this week trying to detail this a little bit. And I was very pleased because I had a final line in the article, which the editors did not take away. I said, the Lebanese are left asking themselves every day, "Shoo fi harb?" Which is it's like asking, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? This is the question we ask ourselves. So first of all, again, I want to remind us all that there is already, for the people in southern Lebanon, a day-to-day war. War is there, right? And we should not forget that. We're sitting in Beirut. Southern Lebanon may feel far, but it's a daily thing. You have 80,000 citizens of Lebanon who have been displaced. I believe that's about 90% of the population of southern Lebanon. You have electricity, power cut off, water damages to water infrastructure, farmland being burnt, phosphorus bombs being reportedly used. People can't harvest their olives. And people are leaving, if not because of the shelling, because of basic necessities are no longer accessible. So I think it's very important for us to be aware that this is already the situation in our country. So Hezbollah has signaled, I think, repeatedly that they don't want this to escalate. And they have moved their red lines quite a few times, I think, because they had, if I'm not mistaken, in Nasrallah's speeches in November, one of the red lines was a ground invasion of Gaza. Well, you know, that has happened. And then I believe that one of the other red lines was Hamas's leadership. Well, they just killed Saleh Harouri in Beirut. So the red lines are moving, because I think that shows the extent to which Hezbollah is trying to avoid an all-out war. But, you know, they have their limits as well. And for the Israelis, it's very clear, and they've made very clear, that they also have 80,000 citizens who are not living in their homes in northern Israel, and they need to go home at some point, and they're not going to live with the threat of Hezbollah on their border. From their point of view, right? So what does that look like? We're never going to see the day where Hezbollah says, okay, boys, let's pack up our stuff and move north of the Litani. That's not going to happen. And there's also never going to be a day, I think, but I might be wrong, where Israel fully respects Resolution 1701. Because if tomorrow they see an opportunity to kill another Hamas leader in the center of Beirut or in the southern suburbs of Beirut, I assume they will go for it. So my read of how this will play out is that there will be, at the end, if it works out, a partial application of 1701 and an understanding for long-term stability on the basis of 1701. And we'll go back to a kind of modus vivendi pre-October 7th, but with further restrictions on what the rules of engagements are. And if you look at the map, the very good maps that Beirut Urban Lab is putting out about the extent of the shelling, both into Lebanon and into Israel, you'll see that the Israelis are in a way already de facto making a buffer zone by the intensity of their shelling. You can see how they're delineating a bit of a border zone where they're destroying, I assume, a lot of Hezbollah infrastructure and picking off a lot of Hezbollah fighters, over 140 already. Now, in his last speech, or his last two speeches, Hassan Nasrallah said a couple of things which I'm sure you all noticed, is the pressure that Hezbollah is putting on Israel will deliver a historic opportunity to liberate land that is still occupied, i.e. the 70 or 13 points along the border. And he said by dialogue. The dialogue will be possible because of our pressure. But the dialogue can only happen after Gaza, the war in Gaza is over. So the question is, what does the war is over look like for Hezbollah? That might also be, you know, up to interpretation. And we've had the US envoy Amos Hochstein coming to Lebanon, suggesting, for the sake of avoiding, you know, mistakes happening along the way, a temporary an interim period of de-escalation along the border, which it appears Hezbollah rejected, because they really want to see a ceasefire in Gaza. I think the issue here is that Hezbollah thinks that by saying, if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, we will discuss 1701 and move away from the border, then it gives the Americans incentives to pressure the Israelis to bring the war to an end in Gaza. I think that is a miscalculation by Hezbollah, or by the parties who think that that's the approach. In general, and I know that's part of the rest of our conversation, the Americans are looking broadly at the region and how they can begin discussions about the day after, when the war in Gaza decreases in intensity. So I think a lot of this is going to happen at the same time. The war in Gaza will decrease in intensity, which will allow Arab countries to start discussing the day after, which will give Hezbollah the ability to tell Lebanese officials it's time to go ahead with negotiations. But there isn't going to be a mission accomplished by the Israelis saying the war is over. It's going to continue to bubble. And of course, for people in Gaza, they will never forget this war. They will, you know, it will take generations. So there is no, the war is over. I think it will be a cessation of hostilities of some kind. But time for the diplomatic window is starting to run out. According to the Israelis, they said 6 to 8 weeks. That was in mid-December. So we're coming up there early to mid-February. On your question about US support for the Israelis, it's hard to gauge at this point. There is no support for such a war. I think one of the phone call that is made most is about Lebanon, and to, especially between Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Yoav Gallant, to not go this way, not go in that direction. So ostensibly there is no support, but once the war starts, I cannot predict if it starts. It's hard to predict how the Biden administration, or President Biden himself, will deal with it. I think Congress will be divided, but the Democrats will be very much opposed, and they're already talking about the need to discuss restrictions on aid to Israel.
Kim, when you talked about this gradual phasing out of the war, and it's clear now that it probably take some sort of, it'll probably be something gradual, but at the same, what conditions, do you think should be met for this gradual phasing out of the war to start? We already know that there are a lot of troops that have already left Gaza, but at the same time, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated just 2 days ago that he expects the war to extend into 2025. So
I missed that.
And of course, yes, he stated that in a speech 2 days ago. And of course, until they achieve all of their objectives, and of course, the stated objective of the elimination of Hamas, and also, regaining security and having enough security assurances is a huge objective. The US, many US officials have already stated indirectly that the elimination of Hamas, the total elimination of Hamas, might not be a possible objective in itself. So what do you think are the conditions that need to be met for this gradual phasing out of the war? And how long can the Israelis sustain?
I really think it depends on the different parties. They all have different conditions, whether it's the Americans or the Israelis or Hamas or the Palestinian people in Gaza. I think for them, the war will not end. It will stay with them. Their houses have been demolished. The infrastructure is destroyed. Universities, hospitals, and 24,000 dead and thousands of injured. So the human toll has been tremendous. And we must not forget that when we discuss the geopolitics of the situation. The Israelis are really starting to clash amongst each other. I was just reading about revelations, I believe in Haaretz, that Netanyahu is apparently, not surprisingly, thwarting the idea of further hostage releases because he believes this might bring an end to the war. And that does not suit him because he is in a politically very precarious situation. And I think that that's something that the Biden administration, or particularly President Biden himself, did not quite factor in at the beginning of this when they gave Biden a big, when they gave Netanyahu a big bear hug. The Americans thought that the bear hug would calm down the ardors of the Israelis, would delay a ground invasion, would help convince the Israelis not to strike Lebanon. That was successful, but for the rest, the bear hug has not worked. Or if that is what the bear hug success looks like, I shudder to think what would have happened without the Americans, providing support for Israel, or trying to whisper in Netanyahu's ears that he didn't need to go all out. It looks horrendous enough already. I think that the two goals that the Israelis put out, destroying Hamas and releasing the hostages, are at odds. Those two don't work together. It's one or the other, and that is becoming increasingly clear to other Israeli officials. And there's a lot of criticism of the conduct of the war, the conduct of Bibi Netanyahu, and the fact that for the longest time, they weren't even meeting with families of the hostages. It's been really quite something to watch. You see all this on social media these days, so it's very much in front of you. And that discussion is now unfolding in Israel. The goal of eradicating Hamas, I mean, if it were possible, I think the Israelis would have done it already. They wanted to eradicate Hezbollah. Well, if they wanted to, if it was possible, they would have done it. I mean, that was the plan in 2006, right? And the argument that Arab officials are making to their American counterparts is that there is no solution to the violence without a political vision. So the war can end temporarily and you can have a cessation of hostilities, but you have to deal with the core issue if you want to avoid further conflict in 5 years, 10 years, etc. And the core issue is the continued occupation of Palestinian territories and the continued siege of Gaza. And that's something that the Biden administration is finally putting back in the forefront of the discussion. So I think you'll see the vision that the Americans are putting forward is beginning to have a decrease of the violence in Gaza, the war, a gradual phasing out of the violence and the onslaught by the Israelis. You need to have Hamas agree to a ceasefire as well, because for Israelis, they're still getting rocket attacks into Tel Aviv and Sderot, etc. And the issue of the hostages, also has to be addressed. You have 100 Israelis who are still hostages, including children, which is, something quite incredible in this day and age. Are the Israelis able to think beyond the rage, the anger, the fear, the vengeance? It's not clear. The Americans are making a very strong case today, or trying to make what they think is a very strong case to the Israelis about the fact that there is another path, and we can discuss that as well. And the answer so far has been, we're not interested. So it's all coming to a head.
Okay. Building on the US stance, I mean, obviously also the US elections are clearly a key consideration for the Biden administration in its decision-making vis-a-vis the conflict, and the continued desire for de-escalation is clear. How long do you think the US can sustain this conflict in the Middle East? What are its immediate goals? We know the US wants to discuss a day after scenario. They have been wanting to discuss this for a while. There have been talks recently, a few days ago also, I mean, more talks on a day after scenario. Do you think this is already in the making? And linked to this, and we'll maybe end with this question, before we open the room for Q&A, what is a plausible day after scenario for Gaza, for Lebanon, and for the wider region? What changes do you see in the regional landscape on the day after? And what are the positions of the different regional actors? The Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, and Iran, obviously.
Yeah, Diana, every one of your questions requires multiple answers. Okay, let me try to unpack this. So I just ended the last answer with the what the Americans are trying to tell the Israelis, and the Israelis saying, we're not interested. Okay, what I've been hearing in Washington since November is that they would like to try to put the issue of a Palestinian state on the table, front-loaded as the end goal, not an Oslo process where you talk forever and then you don't know where you end up. So the end goal is a Palestinian state. it's not going to happen this year, but you put a timeline for it. It should take 3 years, but this is the end goal. And you reverse engineer it by saying, okay, we start with humanitarian pauses, ceasefires, release of hostages, reconstruction of Gaza, revamping the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, new elections in Israel. I think that's what some people in the Biden administration would really like to see happen. I'm not sure it's going to happen. And then you use the leverage of normalization between, or relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia as the leverage to push this forward, right? And I heard this already in November, and now we're seeing it become more public already. So you've had Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, talk about this in Davos. You had Secretary of State Anthony Blinken travel to the Arab world first and to Turkey. So Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, I believe. And then go to Israel to say to them, look, there is an alternative path. You can continue with military action, but you also have the region telling you, we are willing to have relations with you, and we will help reconstruct Gaza. We will potentially figure out the Hamas issue, because Hamas is not just going to disappear, but we want a Palestinian state. So that is, to use your word, a plausible scenario, right? How you sequence that is quite difficult, especially in an election year. It is something that the Biden administration hopes will help it regain credit with Arab Americans, with progressives who are very angry, and rightly so, about the Biden administration's position and the lack of a call for a ceasefire and various other positions. So that is a plausible, theoretically, this is a viable, plausible approach, right? But the details are very complex, and you need the Israelis to also agree. And the answer today in Davos from the Israeli president, Herzog, was anybody who talks about the peace process today is not in his right mind. So you can have elections and remove Netanyahu, but apparently this is a more widespread view in Israel. And I think one thing that has not necessarily percolated for us in the Arab world, because we're dealing with our own traumas and our own, both in Lebanon, but also looking at Gaza, is how much October 7th has impacted the Israeli psyche. And that's not to justify what they're doing in Gaza, but you have to understand analytically what it did to them and why they're reacting the way they're doing. Otherwise, you cannot devise the correct policy. So that's the vision. The goal is the idea is for this to help Biden be re-elected. That would help him get re-elected, because I don't think it's a done deal that Trump is coming back. I was asked this question today. That also helps to deal with the Lebanon part of it, because I don't know whether many of you noticed, but in October, the Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, gave an interview to The Economist. He called The Economist to come to him to give them an interview. It was not a request by The Economist to interview him. And in that interview, he put forward a peace plan, which is rather unusual for a Lebanese prime minister. We don't usually put peace plans. That's either the Syrians or the Iranians, etc. And in it, he rather intriguingly said, the usual humanitarian pauses, ceasefire, hostages, reconstruction, Gaza, etc. Two-state solution. Hamas and Hezbollah would give up their weapons, but Iran needs a seat at the table. And I keep wondering whether we should just dismiss this as a personal initiative by Meati, or whether he is getting signals from elsewhere. And I think it's the latter, actually, because he repeated that when he sent the letter to the UN about Resolution 1701, talking about Hal Shamil. So there are different parts of this that are starting to align, but a lot of it depends on the Israelis, right? And I think that what is very interesting this time, because I know the Saudis got a lot of criticism for the idea that they would normalize with Israel, or still think about it today after everything that happened. But there are two interesting points to make here. I mean, the Saudis can be criticized for a lot of things, but on this, I had a conversation with a Saudi academic recently, who's close to the thinking in the in the upper echelons of power, and I asked him, "Are you really going to normalize with the Israelis after everything that happened in Gaza?" And his answer was very pragmatic. First of all, he said, "Well, we're very pragmatic," but the rest of his answer really surprised me. He said, "Nobody has clean hands in this region. Look at Syria and look at Yemen." So I thought that was an interesting perspective, that they realize that, of course, you have to criticize the Israelis and denounce what they've done, but other players in this region have also done some terrible things. So that's one. The second point is that the Israelis have always criticized the Palestinians as never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. That was always the excuse, always the Palestinians who missed the opportunity. What I'm seeing happen now, which is very interesting, is both the Americans and the Saudis, and I assume they're working together on that, making clear that the offer is there for the Israelis. Normalization is there. It's up to you to take that opportunity, or you might miss, the jackpot of relations with the Arab world. So it's basically turning the tables on the Israelis and saying, normalization is still there, but if you're going to walk away from it, that's your loss.
And the Saudi foreign minister made it very clear in Davos, and he said it very clearly. He said, "We're ready to normalize, but you need to give the Palestinians a state." And yes. I also found the comments,
which is something that they have had to adjust, because let's not forget that before October 7th, the deal that was being discussed did not include a Palestinian state. It included, sorry, I'm trying to remember the details.
And so an authority, an autonomous authority.
No, not even. No. It did not include much autonomy. It included a freeze of settlements. It included a transfer of Area C, which is fully under Israeli control, to Area B, which is under joint control. And one more thing, I think a promise not to annex any further territory. So it was not very much. And it was going to be finalized in February. And it was going to be called the Jerusalem-Jeddah Declaration, which has a nice ring to it, except that it failed the Palestinians. And I think now the Saudis are very cognizant, and they became very cognizant early on, that they had to ask for a lot more to protect themselves and to deliver for the Palestinians something tangible and irreversible. I saw that word today in the Financial Times, quoting an Arab official. It has to, that promise of a Palestinian state has to be irreversible.
And it's clear that they're talking about the day after. I mean, even in Davos, they're talking about the day after. Turki Faisal today had very interesting comments also about the fact that neither Hamas nor the Israeli Authority nor the Palestinians.
That was actually from October. That was actually from
October. Okay,
yes,
I saw it
October, and it's doing the rounds again today because Christiane Amanpour put it out there on her Twitter.
Yes.
Look, I heard a very interesting comment in a forum where I was at, where the Palestinians were told, no one should run for elections as Palestinians unless they agree to a two-state solution. And the Palestinian former official replied and said, yes, and that should apply to the Israelis. No Israeli should run for office if they don't support a two-state solution. Because I don't think that elections in Israel, if they happen, are going to bring us a left-wing government. You know, this country elected the most far-right government in its history, and it brought us Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, etc. last year. Now, yes, they had 30 consecutive weeks of protests against their government, but now, as in countries that go through war, there is a bit of a rallying around the flag. There is rejection of Netanyahu, but there is, I think the polls don't show a rejection of the war effort up until now. I think that's going to start. But if you were to hold elections tomorrow in Israel, I think you would still get a center-right government. And so the Americans expect that it would be somebody like Benny Gantz, but they're probably hoping that it would be somebody like Yair Lapid from the sort of Yesh Yatid or something party. So yeah, it's not because you get somebody else than Netanyahu that you get, you know, a left-wing government. And what the Americans are also worried about, or what they would have liked to avoid, but I'm starting to think it's not going to be possible, because I don't see Netanyahu going anywhere, actually. I think the Americans would have liked to avoid rewarding Netanyahu with a peace deal and normalization with the Saudis. But I don't know. I think that might be the price to end the war in Gaza, that he stays in power and signs on the dotted line and gets to travel to Jeddah.
Interesting. Thank you, Kim. Your comment on the results of any future elections in Israel also matches somewhat Maha Yahya's comment on the chat, who says that even if elections were to take place today in Israel, it's likely that we will end up with more of the same, or possibly an even stronger ultra-right.
The polls show center-right, but not far-right. But, you know, things are very movable at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to start with the questions that are on the chat. Antoine Souma had asked a question about the deal and the making a Palestinian state, peace with Israel, normalization with KSA. I believe we have covered this. Okay. So also Malik had a question saying one of the points that have been discussed in the Arab tour of Biden is to discuss the afterwar in Israel. That means Netanyahu and the extreme right are out. How will this happen, and what could be the future power in Israel? We've also addressed this. Rula is asking, Haaretz today or yesterday was talking about the possibility of a civil war in Israel because of the current divisions. What's your comment on that? Do you believe it's plausible?
I'm not enough of an expert, so I would not want to predict civil war, you know, anywhere.
Okay, so Sergio Jalil,
I think there are a lot of I think there are a lot of tensions within Israel, but there is, like I said, also a rallying around the flag. Maybe not around Netanyahu, but around the flag. But the tensions are really bubbling up. But I always think it's very important not to engage in wishful thinking. When you're looking at, you know, there are a lot of people who say, oh, you know, Iran, the regime in Iran is going to crumble. This is, you know, this is the end of the Iranian Revolution, you know, after the uprisings, after the Mahsa Amini was killed, you know, there is a tendency to wish for the collapse of the country or the player that you don't like, right? But we have to remain poised and analytical. And so while some people may want to see you know, chaos within Israeli society, I'm not sure that that's what we're looking at. I think we're looking at very confrontational clashes between the families of the hostages who imposed on Netanyahu to begin to talk about the hostages and to work to bring them back. So you'll see more of that, and you'll see, I think, more protests against the war.
Sergio Jalil is asking, from what you described, it looks like the Netanyahu government is the party that wants to extend the conflict in order to minimize or make their culpability erode. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think Netanyahu was already, on the ropes before October 7th. 30 consecutive weeks of protests. I mean, that's, I think, fairly unheard of in any country. Not here, not in Iran. I don't think there's ever been 30 consecutive weeks ongoing. So that was quite considerable. He's also facing corruption accusations. And so he really has an interest of staying in power. And he is, Mr. Teflon, nothing sticks. So he would like to avoid corruption trial, and he would like to avoid what is definitely going to be a commission of inquiry into who is responsible for October 7th. There are a lot of people who have a lot of questions to answer. There are a lot of failures in Israel that made this possible, including hubris and incompetence that allowed this attack on October 7th to unfold the way it did. So he knows that the minute the war is over or declared over, which is probably also, I'm thinking out loud here, he is not going to declare the war over. He's not going to use those words because that's the end of him. I don't think he has what it takes, luckily for us, to actually launch a war against Lebanon. But he's not the only one making those decisions. Traditionally, Netanyahu has not launched wars. With all his failings and faults, he has not launched wars, but October 7th was an out of ordinary event. And so he possibly may want to make that deal to normalize with Saudi Arabia, give the Palestinians a state. I don't think he has it in him. Some people will say, no, Israeli has it in him to give the Palestinians a state, and that's a fair comment. But Netanyahu in particular has worked his whole career to undermine the idea of a Palestinian state. From, the 80s, he was, and that's where his relationship with Biden began, when he was a deputy ambassador in Washington. And that's how long that relationship has been going between the two. So I don't know if that answers the question, but he's going to try to hold on to power for as long as he can.
Okay. So Rula is asking, Kim, can you please talk about the Saudi position in all of this? I think we've covered that. Where do they stand along with the Qataris and the Bahrainis and the UAE and the Bahrainis that were part of the Houthi attack? And the UAE role as well. So maybe we've covered the Saudi position, I believe, maybe a bit more on the Qataris and the UAE.
The Qataris are doing a lot of the back and forth with Hamas. So the different countries in the region are each taking a role. The Egyptians are, first of all, trying to stay standing because I think they're under a lot of pressure. But one thing has been made very clear by the Egyptians and by the Americans: there is no way in which the forced displacement of Palestinians into Egypt is an acceptable scenario. That is a no. That doesn't mean that the Israelis are going to stop trying, but the Americans and the Egyptians have made very clear that is a no-go. The Egyptians are trying to keep their border secure because, let's be honest, they're part of the siege on Gaza. They have been part of the siege on Gaza for many years. They're the ones who enforce it on the Rafah side. So they and the Jordanians have their own particular concerns about this spilling over into their own borders. The Jordanians have a similar concern, and the Jordanians have been the most adamant against discussing the day after in November and December. I'm not sure where they are today, but they kept saying to the Americans, there is no discussing the day after. If we don't know what the day after in Gaza looks like, if everything is destroyed, what are we discussing? The Saudis were there as well in December, but it clearly looks like they've moved, and they're willing today to say, okay, we will engage on the day after, but XYZ, as I've said. The Emiratis have obviously clearly maintained their relationship with the Israelis. They've not said we'll recall our ambassador. I think actually he is not physically present in Israel, but they have not officially recalled him, like the Jordanians. But they're also not willing to play ball with Netanyahu, which I think surprised Netanyahu. And again, going back to this point I made about having to understand the psyche of the Israelis, Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly called Mohammed bin Zayed to say, will you pay for the salaries of the tens of thousands of Palestinians who used to work in Israel? Because they can't, we're not allowing them to work in Israel anymore, and they're becoming a burden on the economy in the West Bank. And I think if the reporting is true, Mohammed bin Zayed was rightly shocked by this request. You break it, you own it, so you pay for it, right? How can you ask us? And I think that's where the Israelis are not yet able to understand also how much has changed in the Arab world. So the Emiratis are, I think, working in coordination to some extent, despite also the rivalries or tensions, let's say, between the Emiratis and the Saudis. They're working together with the Americans to present this plan for the day after and tell the Israelis, there is an opportunity here for you to take. And I want to make one more point here, Jana. And I know this, I may be going out on a limb, and I'm happy to eat my shoelaces later on if I get proven wrong. But I also think that Iran's position is changing. Going back to the points I made at the beginning, where they've reached the limits of what they're willing to do for the Palestinians. And we can have a different discussion about whether, peace talks are the right approach or violent struggle is the right approach, right? That's a different discussion. Is it the axis of resistance, or is it the Oslo process? Which worldview do you prefer? That's a different discussion. You could argue that except for Hezbollah pushing the Israelis out of Lebanon, armed struggle has not achieved much for the Palestinians, and the Iranians have used the card of the Palestinian cause to advance their own interests in the region. And you see that also bubbling up in discussions in the regions. You have a lot of Syrians who are very angry. First you kill us in Syria, and then you use the Palestinians to, fight your war against Israel, and where are you? From reading Najib Miati's interview and speaking to some officials here and speaking to some people who are close to the thinking in Iran, my assessment is that Iran would be willing to accept a Palestinian state without openly acknowledging the existence of Israel. But if you accept a Palestinian state on the borders of 1967, then you've accepted the existence of Israel in exchange for regime survival guarantees.
Where would that leave Hezbollah?
The Iranians, I suspect, will want to guarantee their gains in the region, and that includes Hezbollah. They will not want to ever feel the threat of what they see as Sunni regimes ganging up against them, like Iraq. Again, understanding the psyche of the other, right? The Iran-Iraq war left indelible scars in the minds of Iranians and the collective memory and the trauma of DNA imprinted. They never want to live through that again. It was absolutely devastating. If I'm not mistaken, 1 million Iranians died. That's huge. So everything that we've seen since then has been to avoid direct war, to have these forward defense bases and use proxies to fight America and Israel. And it sounds to me today like they're saying, okay, we'll accept a Palestinian state, and but we want guarantees of regime survival. Don't target us. I'm not sure where that leaves the nuclear file. I think they will be able to compromise on that, knowing that they're really quite close to being a threshold state if they're not already. So they don't need to fully develop it, but they can keep what they have and use that as a lever. And I suspect that they will want to maintain not Hezbollah as is, but when we've heard these conversations before, incorporated in the army, have something like the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, where it's part of the armed forces. I'm not saying it's going to happen, and I'm not justifying. I'm explaining what I think is the thinking. That this is the, as they say, the mu'aydali. You know, we'll close our eyes to the creation of a Palestinian state, but we want, and that's why I think that what you're seeing today is a negotiation between Iran and America. And if you listen to Hezbollah's, Nasrallah's speeches, he mostly mentions, or at the beginning, he mostly mentioned America. Israel was barely mentioned.
Okay, we have around 12 more questions. I'll make it very quick.
I'll try to be shorter as well in my answers.
Okay, brilliant. So one of the questions is, you mentioned in an interview early in the war on Gaza that the Biden administration was doing a good job calming things down. How would you interpret the current Biden behavior of total support to Israel, including providing weapons versus their stated aim of de-escalation? Is it fair to say that Biden is a prisoner to his outdated Zionist dogma, or is it the action of US election lobbying that is binding his hands?
I think that interview was probably very early on, before the ground invasion. And as I said in this talk as well, I think the one real achievement so far is the fact that they've so far dissuaded the Israelis from striking Lebanon. And that has required a lot of constant phone calls. Like a lot of phone calls. I mean, I know I speak sometimes to American officials, and I can see how much effort that has required. So it's not a given, right? You know, the relationship between the US and Israel is one that requires a whole new session as well. There have been ebbs and flow in the relationship. It has grown steadily closer. It has always, I mean, it has traditionally been close, but there have also been moments of real pressure by America on Israel. Namely, during the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, where President Reagan called the Prime Minister of Israel, Begin, at the time, and said, "Mr. Prime Minister, I have a Holocaust on my TV screen every evening." Can you imagine the American president calling the Israeli prime minister saying, you know, I have a Holocaust on my screen? The Israeli prime minister was not pleased with that phrase, and he responded, "I know what a Holocaust is." The Americans were furious, and that's why the American Secretary of State at the time resigned also, because he had given a sort of yellow light to the Israelis to go all the way up to Beirut, whereas the understanding initially was that they stopped 40 kilometers in. And then to push the Israelis out of Lebanon, Reagan at the beginning of 1983 stopped the sale of, I can't remember, F-16s or whatever planes to Israel. So there are moments of pressure on Israel and restrictions on aid. And then Similarly, when George Bush Sr., the father, in 1990-91 wanted to launch the Madrid conference and the peace process, they also restricted aid to Israel because they wanted an end to settlement construction. There hasn't been a lot of that kind of pressure since then. James Baker, I think, was the only one who could really pull it off. And I think President Biden is, on that aspect, stuck a little bit in the past. And I think it's a struggle for some of his top officials to bring him on board, which is why earlier in the conversation, sometimes I corrected myself in saying the Biden administration said, no, actually, I mean President Biden. And I think we might be in a situation similar to the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2020, where he was cautioned against it by, I think, most of his top officials. And yet he decided, I made my mind, we're out. So I think a lot of the work is also being done on President Biden himself to convince him that this is the way to go. I assume that if Blinken and Sullivan are now out there and saying this is the deal, Palestinian state normalization, that President Biden is now on board with that. However, he has not uttered the word ceasefire. He has not uttered the word ceasefire. And on the 100th day of after October 7th, his statement did not mention the word Palestinian once. So old reflexes die hard. Sorry?
I'm just saying it was a bit shameful. He didn't mention any.
Yes. But I think also there is a distribution of tasks often in administrations where the president will take the flak for some things and will not pretend, but will continue to be buddy-buddy with the Israelis and say, listen, but I have my Congress, and my Congress is starting to be really critical. Because if you listen to some of these Democratic senators, and even I think some Republicans, if I'm not mistaken, they're very critical at the moment of Israel. So everybody plays a different role to make some of these policies happen.
Thank you, Kim. Eddie is asking, who would be relatively better for Lebanon, Biden or Trump?
The million-dollar question. I think just generally, it's not so much who is better for Lebanon. I think we like to think in those very narrow terms, what is good for us. I think we are part of a larger geopolitical situation. I worry that if Netanyahu stays in power and Trump comes to power, the combination of Netanyahu and Trump is quite dangerous for the region. And I do think that you might possibly see direct war against Iran. That would be a potential scenario.
Clear.
But I worry about a Trump presidency more generally because of what it means for minorities, for women, for education, for migrants, for a lot of different aspects of what also has an impact on the rest of the world.
Definitely. Kathy is asking, what about the 1 million settlers in the West? I think when we were talking about the two-state solution, she's asking, what about the 1 million settlers in the West Bank where the Palestinian state would presumably be?
Yeah, well, that's also the question that nobody has given me an answer to so far. So I don't know. That is the reason why a lot of people say the two-state solution is dead. We should go for a one-state solution. The Israelis are never going to go for a one-state solution. And then you have some people say, well, they will have to, because at some point there will be more Palestinians than Israelis. And so, you can't, you have to accept that they are part of your territory. Well, actually, no, because the Israelis, I think, will just keep the wall and keep the Palestinians behind the wall and have wars every now and then. They're not going to suddenly say, okay, welcome into the state of Israel. So I think unless I'm misunderstanding the argument that people make about a one-state solution, I think a one-state solution is not going to happen either. And also, I recently spoke to a demographer who looks at demographic trends around the world, and he made a very interesting observation about Israel and the Palestinians. He said they have roughly the same growth rate, mortality, natality. And so the Palestinians are not going to win this from a demographic perspective, because that's also something that a lot of people say, just go for a one-state solution and eventually, you know, the Palestinians will outnumber the Israelis. It turns out that that's not going to happen. So we're stuck to the two-state solution, whether you want to call it two-state solution, whether you want to call it separation, whether you want to call it coexistence, whether you want to call it whatever you want to call it, or an entity, or, you know, I think that's the only option available, and that's what everybody is talking about. But 100%, Mireille, nobody has yet uttered the word settlement, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just not sure how that's going to work. And with every peace process, if we get to this point, there is violence. Remember that Sadat was killed for signing peace with Israel, and that Yitzhak Rabin was killed for signing peace with the Palestinians. So to remove 700,000 settlers from the West Bank, if that is the idea, is not going to be easy. And I'm just not sure they want to live under the Palestinian Authority and give up their guns.
Ali is asking, where is China and Russia in all of this?
Nowhere, basically.
Conveniently nowhere?
I think the Russians and the Chinese are very, very good at talking a big talk about being the anti-American, better alternative, honest broker, etc. I haven't, you know, I haven't seen the Chinese anywhere. There was a lot of talk after October 7th, I mean, during this whole period, about how, yes, you know, Western values have been shown to be accessoire. You know, it's sometimes yes, but sometimes no. It applies to some people, but not to everybody. And so the global South generally is up in arms about this. And that's why it's so interesting to see South Africa at the ICJ. And for a while, there were a lot of people theorizing that this was an opportunity for the Chinese and the Russians, that they would use this to gather people in their camp. But I'm not seeing it happen. The Chinese have been incredibly silent because they don't like chaos. They want to look like they can deliver peace, but actually they don't have what it takes to be a broker in the region. The Israelis are not going to listen to them. They don't have any stakes with the Palestinians. I don't think they have a relationship with Hamas. So they're just not able. So we can criticize the Americans as much as we want that they're not honest brokers, but it looks like they're the only brokers. And now the Saudis have an interesting role to sort of be the leverage. And when it comes to the Russians, I think they're just quite satisfied to see the Americans getting sort of bogged down in the Middle East again and getting distracted from Ukraine and all of that.
Christine is asking, while reverse engineering the end game of a two-state solution, what should Lebanon and the Lebanese diaspora focus on for this process? We surely don't want Iran at that Lebanese table as a concession. I think probably the question is, if I understood it well.
You don't want Lebanon to be a concession to the Iranians.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Lebanon always exists in gray areas. So I think it will never be a concession, but it will be like a modus vivendi type thing. I'm not sure. I think that's a very good question, and I'll be very upfront that I don't have a very detailed answer, but I think it is one that as policymakers, you need to really think about. I think it's been, sorry?
But would you say that, I mean, Iran is going to try to, I mean, to preserve Hezbollah's influence as much as possible?
Of course. Wouldn't you if you were them, right?
Obviously.
Wouldn't you? It's the rational thing to do
and
for
it's the top priority, right? So in their list of concessions, probably everything would come first. If we don't talk about their internal security and their nuclear program, and their list of regional concessions, would Hezbollah come last, or is there?
I think there are, you know, it's a puzzle where everything has a bit of a similar or different weight. Look, Hezbollah is part of Lebanon, right? You can dismiss them as an Iranian creation, but they are part of the fabric. Some people don't like them, some people criticize them. They're entrenched in the corrupt establishment. They stand accused of having a role in assassinations. But I heard that once from, you know, a former prime minister who said, they're not going anywhere. You know, they're Lebanese citizens. And that's something that I think sometimes Americans don't understand, or American members of Congress, particularly Republicans. So one, they're not going anywhere. Sorry, I'm getting asked, confirm your speaking language. It sounds like you've switched to Spanish. Shall I just say cancel?
We're still talking in English, yeah.
Hablo un poco de español, but that's about it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think the question on every Lebanese person's mind is, will they come out even stronger after this? I mean,
it's really up to us. I think it's up to us. I think it's up to Lebanese stakeholders, you know, officials, you guys at Kulluna Irada, you know, how are you going to manage this coming phase? I think we have to stop asking, what are the Americans going to do? What is Iran's plan? What are we doing, right? What is the policy that we're putting forward? How are we navigating this phase instead of just waiting to see for the outcome? So I think it's been good to see that there has been what looked like a concerted effort by various personalities, political parties, to say very clearly, we don't want war. We don't want war. We support the Palestinians in their plight, in their suffering, but Lebanon has paid its dues when it comes to the Palestinian cause and various other causes. We don't want war. So I thought that was already a very empowered position. Instead of just thinking, instead of just asking every day, شو في حرب؟ لا ما بدنا حرب. So that's the first step. And then I think that, you know, with all his shortcomings, Prime Minister Miati is actually putting forward some interesting proposals, which can be dismissed, but which I think can be something to build on. But the reality is that we live in the region that we live in. And Iran is also not going anywhere, and they're not going to give up their gains in the region. The idea that I heard from a high-ranking Saudi official is that the best way to counter Iran is to put forward a positive vision for the region instead of war and you know, zahfan. Let's put forward a positive vision. And you know, I'm not sure that that necessarily works in the short term, because we've also seen that economic progress does not necessarily turn countries into progressive states. I mean, that was the idea with China and the WTO, but they did not develop like that. But at least it might remove the Palestinian cause from the Iranian hand, that card, and reduce the stature, or reduce the impact of its actions in countries like Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. I understand the question, you know, is Lebanon going to be sacrificed for the sake of Iran getting what it wants and therefore a Palestinian state, etc.? I don't think we should think of it in these terms, because I don't think there are sacrifices. Sometimes there are, and I know I'm taking a little bit longer because it's an interesting question and it has different layers. In 1990, during the Gulf War, Lebanon, in a way, was sacrificed when the Americans told the Syrians, okay, you take Lebanon, but you participate in the Gulf War, right? I think those lessons have been learned. And if they have not been learned by the Americans, they should have been learned by the Lebanese, because what ensued was 15 years of occupation, which had a heavy price paid, which had a heavy impact on Lebanon. So I think it's about putting forward, if we cannot agree on all the details, because we're not necessarily a homogeneous country, and even the opposition is splintered, etc., to at least put forward the basic minimum that we can agree on. But you're right. I think that right now, the sort of, if we want to simplify let's call it the pro-Iran camp, I think absolutely they're going to push now for a presidential election and say Sulaiman Frangieh and Hezbollah will go quiet on the border. That's possible. So what is the counter proposal? Right?
We're going to have to wait and see also how coherent the opposition will be, and if they're going to be able to put something on the table that is also a strong counter proposition or not. We were supposed to end the call now. We still have a few questions. If you mind, do you mind giving us another 10 minutes, maybe?
5? I have to go somewhere. 5.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll try to speak fast.
So I apologize. I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions on the chat. Mark, I'm still going to go through them sequentially. Sure. So do you think there is any real capable appetite in Israel for a two-state solution? I think we've addressed this. I think
at the moment, no. At the moment, no. But I think the Americans are trying to make an offer that the Israelis can't refuse.
Can't refuse. If not any...
And sorry, and one more thing on that point. The argument that the Americans are making to justify Biden's bear hug of Netanyahu is that it will deliver in the long term, and that Biden now has credit with the Israeli public, because the Israeli public, the citizens, found that they got much more support from Biden than their own leadership. And so, the Biden administration thinks that President Biden himself can sell the idea of a two-state solution to the Israeli public because of the credit he has with the Israeli public.
I'll wrap up with this question. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to actually ask all of them, but if things do in fact move towards normalization with Saudi for ending the war, is it possible that Iran or independently other factions pull another card to prevent this again from happening? Is it directly related to how solid the solution for Palestinians would be? And given how hard Netanyahu would fight against the Palestinian state?
So I actually didn't get the question. Whose is it?
If things do in fact move towards normalization with Saudi for ending the war, is it possible that Iran or independently other factions pull another card to prevent this?
No, I don't think so. I think everybody is trying to get on the same page, and I think the Saudis are talking to the Iranians about this. And the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which happened last year, March, which was just a way to diffuse tensions and buy some time for everybody, turned out to be very useful after October 7th, because it allowed the Saudis and the Iranians to talk directly to each other. And it allowed the Iranians a channel to say directly to the Saudis, we're not involved. We're not going to attack you. We don't want war. I'm not saying that's exactly what they said, but the message was roughly like that. And so I think the hope is, but I might be wrong, that while the Saudis and the Americans and the Emiratis, etc., are dealing with the Palestinian-Israel part of this, there's also a discussion with the Iranians about what they want. And I know from speaking to Saudi officials that they were interested in exploring what the Iranians were willing to give up in exchange for, allowing the regime to continue, which we must also remember comes at a great cost for the Iranian people. There's always a loser somewhere, unfortunately.
We're gonna wrap up with this, and a comment from Mirai Qatar also saying that Lebanon needs a stronger and more unified opposition, at least on the bare minimum. I think everybody on this call would agree with this.
I leave that to you, the policymakers.
Kim, thank you very much for this session. It was very informative, extremely interesting. Everyone on the call, thank you for being here. We look forward to future discussions. Have a very good evening, Kim.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you. Take care. Bye.